there's no alternate universe where I do this the best that I can and it's perfect. And then I raise children who are like completely unflawed. And yet, here we are in a situation where I find myself feeling like a good mom when they behave the way that is expected by society for them to behave in a certain situation. And I find myself feeling guilty or like a not so great mom when maybe they're having a hard time with something. Welcome to Worthy Mother Podcast. I'm your host, Emily Hardy, a mom of two on a mission to help moms everywhere feel less alone. This is not a parenting podcast. Instead, it's a space for pushing back against societal expectations of perfection and embracing self-compassion in your motherhood journey. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome to Worthy Mother Podcast. We are undeniably back in school season and all of the various things that come along with that. I found myself over summer really just wanting to get back in the groove of things, the routines that we have in place during the school year, and now we're in it. And there's also challenges that come along with that. One of the things I want to talk about is how sometimes our worth as mothers, our sense of worth as mothers, can end up tied up in our children and how well they're performing, how well they are coming across as, quote, normal human beings and well-behaved children, obedient children, kids who listen to what we have to say, kids who make the right choices when they're not with us, all these things, right? We can end up attaching their goodness or their perceived goodness to our own sense of self-worth. And this has to do with a lot of the things we talk about here on the podcast, about the external messaging we get about how we are supposed to show up in the world as mothers. But part of showing up in the world as a, quote, good mom is having these, quote, good kids, right? Like you can probably imagine this in your own life of how, sometimes when your child is being praised for behavior or you're being praised on your child's behavior, that can feel like something about your worth and like I'm a good mom because my child is doing this thing that's perceived as being good by others. And then the same thing if you get like mean stares while your kid is having a meltdown or negative feedback about your child's performance in school, things like that, it can feel like, oh my God, I'm a horrible mom. I'm failing my child. I'm doing something wrong. That's why they're not doing XYZ correctly or to the standard that society says it should be done. And I want to acknowledge that fully, that is something that happens to so many of us, that kind of narrative. It happens to me for sure. And it makes sense, right? Like we are responsible for raising our children. We are putting so much effort into doing this well, to parenting in a way that we want to parent so that they grow up to be these good, well-rounded humans. And so to completely validate why we often connect our worth to their, quote, goodness, it makes sense. It makes sense that we do this. And yet at the same time, it's not really a great thing that we do for a number of reasons. So that is what I want to get into in this episode today. Why we need to kind of stop doing that or put effort into detaching our own worth and start to really see that as like two separate things, because your worth is inherent. Your worth is not attached to how your child shows up, even when there is a sense of responsibility there. So you might think it would make sense to dive right into like how this happens and the situations where this can happen, where we feel badly about ourselves because of something our child does or is perceived to have done, or something about them, the way that they are presenting themselves to others or not doing the best job in certain things, how we can see that as reflecting negatively on ourselves. But I think there's another part to this that is almost more important to laying that groundwork of like what we're actually talking about. And that is when, as a mother, we are praised for our child doing something well. I know I've shared once or twice on the podcast a story of like, it was years ago now. I went out to breakfast with my two children. I don't know what I was thinking. It was busy. We went to breakfast and they were so, what I'll say, well behaved, right? They just sat there and ate their food and were cute and having fun, no meltdowns. We were there for a while. It was busy. And I had people coming up to me saying, good job, mom, like, complimenting this. I find myself going back to that example from years ago because really it doesn't happen often where my children are like so on point with what is expected by society of them because they're kids, but it does sometimes, right? When we go to the dentist, my kids like really like the dentist and they're quiet and listen and do what they're told and are happy and sweet and just glad to be there. They're like the perfect patients at the dentist, really. And it is so not a representation of how my kids are like in life, but it's the reality of that situation. And, it can start to feel like, oh, I'm such a good mom for this. Even if we're not getting that input from other people of like, oh, great job, mom, your kids are so well behaved. But there's situations, right, where we do get that input. And then even when we don't, we can kind of make it seem like, oh, because they're acting this certain way, that must mean I'm doing something right. But those moments when people are complimenting you based on your child's behavior, based on their perceived goodness, that can be particularly insidious when it comes to shaping the way that we connect our own worth to how well they're performing. Because if that is true, then it is also true that if they are not performing up to the standard of society that society has for kids that are pretty age inappropriate and not really aligned with like the fact that we're humans and not perfect robots. When they are not exactly in line with that, we can also then feel like this is my fault. I'm doing something wrong because my child is not acting perfectly in this situation. And that can really be anything from like behaviors, if they're having a meltdown, if they are, getting in fights with kids at school, if they are having a hard time regulating their emotions in any situation, if they are, even acting inappropriately for a certain situation. So, like if you're at a wedding and they're crying or whatever it is, right? They're not adhering to the cultural norms for that particular environment because they're a child and they don't have the necessarily capacity to understand and differentiate and then regulate to that situation, right? Like it makes sense. But then it's also like their performance with things. If they are having a hard time in school, maybe struggling with mathematics or with reading, or if they are not super interested in the sport you have them signed up for and they're like super distracted all during practice, or when somebody has a conversation with them and they're interrupting and they don't have like those social norms down, it can start to feel like, ugh, if I was doing this right, then wouldn't they be doing better in those areas? Now, logically, I can think, okay, that's not how this works. Me being the quote perfect mom does not raise perfect kids. That's not the goal. That's not reality. Nobody is perfect. I look out there in the world, nobody is perfect. There's no alternate universe where I do this the best that I can and it's perfect. And then I raise children who are like completely unflawed. Doesn't happen. And yet, here we are in a situation where I find myself feeling like a good mom when they behave the way that is expected by society for them to behave in a certain situation. And I find myself feeling guilty or like a not so great mom when maybe they're having a hard time with something. I will even go as far as to say my son, who is now in first grade, when he was in kindergarten, he was having a hard time in his class with picking up what he was learning. I knew he was doing okay at home. He was understanding the concepts they were learning. However, in class, he wasn't able to demonstrate that. And I'm coming from the background as somebody who was an elementary school teacher. I taught kindergarten for a year. I know what the kindergarten California state standards are. I am pretty aware of where he was at, what I believe about how kids perform differently than each other. They're not all the same. The goal is not for them to be all the same, all these things, right? And yet, still hearing that, there was that sense of like, oh my God, I should be better at this. Why is my kid not able to read at the level he's supposed to be able to read at this time, right? Like, I should have the skills. I should be doing a better job. I should be prioritizing this. I'm a bad mom for this. When I really sat there and thought about that, it was like, okay, maybe there are things that we can do a better job working on, right? I can support him now that I have this information and support him in growing in those areas that he needs to grow in. But this isn't a reflection of me and my worth as a human being or as a mother. And that's a really important distinction because we talk about the responsibility of parenting to do things like break cycles of trauma, to teach our kids how to regulate their emotions and to teach them how to function in the world and to give them the space to process things and to set up the best learning environment for them so that when they do go to kindergarten, they're ready to learn and read because we've set that up at home. We have these conversations and they're important to have. And there is so much responsibility we have as parents to make sure that we are instilling these things in our children that are important. Like, I want my kids to go out into the world and treat people with respect. I want my kids to go out into the world and put energy and effort into the things that they're committed committed to putting energy and effort into. I want my kids to be excited about learning. I want my kids to, quite frankly, be liked. I want my kids to be liked by other people. And, that's something that it's like, why? We could get into that, but it's like these things that I want for my children. And I have a certain responsibility to teach them as their parent. That is important that I take responsibility for my role in teaching them how to function in society, in teaching them how to be a good person and harnessing that and pouring into who they are and who they're developing into and teaching them how that fits into the world. But at no point in that is the goal to make them perfect human beings. Like, it's just not the goal. And when we are holding their goodness alongside our worth as like their goodness equals how good I am, what is the goal there? We're not good enough unless they're perfect. That's not okay. That's not something that I actually believe. And it also adds a lot of pressure to them and continues these kind of cycles of perfectionism and people pleasing, because we're only going to feel good about ourselves as parents if they are doing good. And so they're seeing that reflected in us. They're seeing that we feel badly about ourselves if they're doing poorly or perceived as doing poorly. That's too much pressure. I can't speak for anyone listening, but I know for me, when I think of the goal of raising my children, I want to stay as far away from instilling people pleasing and perfectionist tendencies in my children. I want to stay as far away from raising children who don't know how to set boundaries because they feel like they are supposed to be constantly doing their best, and their best has to look like this high level of performance all the time. Like, I don't want that for my kids. And yet, in holding their goodness, their perceived level of goodness, how well they behave, how well they perform, all these things in connection to who I am, my worth, if I'm a good mom, because I want to be that good mom, the tendency then to push and to shame when things aren't perfect, it's high. And while it's not as simple as just saying, we're going to stop with this, we're going to stop with the equating their goodness to our own sense of worth, it's really something we want to be thinking about. For me, how I try to be mindful of that is when I do receive feedback about my child in whatever way, whether that's a weird look at a restaurant or a phone call from their teacher, or again, whatever it is, whatever my initial response is, like internal response of like, I feel shame, I feel guilt, I feel crummy because this is a reflection on me. I really pull that forward and look at that and say, what does this actually mean about me? Not about my child. What does this mean about me? And sometimes that is, I need to be doing a better job of teaching my child the appropriate way to respond when somebody does something you don't like, right? Or I need to be having conversations with my child about how we can better support them in the classroom. There might be things that I need to do or that I want to do to remedy a situation. But I can't take on this guilt and shame of them not being perfect. And really pulling that forward and looking at that, making it clear that that is what's happening when it's happening, can be hugely impactful. It's something that you can literally do just in a pause, a moment of, okay, what am I feeling right now? Why am I feeling that way? Is that true? And what can I actually do about this situation that doesn't necessarily reflect on my worth? But it's also really helpful to get it out. So writing it down, writing through those thoughts and feelings, talking about it with a therapist or a coach, just kind of to work on what's going on behind the feelings. That can be really, really powerful, really helpful to, again, getting it out there. These tendencies to equate our children's perceived goodness to our own worth are pretty ingrained. They're going to be pretty ingrained because it's what we've learned. We've learned to be perfectionists. We've learned to be people pleasers. We've learned to be good performers and to put on that mask when we're having a hard time. And so you likely, if you are anything like me, and if you are somebody who is impacted by those kind of tendencies, you likely will default to the equating of their goodness to your worth. So being aware of that and then being aware of when it's happening is huge. This is so important for us as mothers. This is important for you as a mother, that you can really hold your own worth as a person outside of everything around you, because it is innate, it is deeply ingrained in you. You are worth every good thing. You are somebody who is worthy in the deepest sense of the word. So doing this work to disconnect the things that make us have a lower sense of self-worth is important for that. But it's also important because of how it stops the perpetuation of these cycles with our children, with the next generation. And that cannot be understated. It is so huge when we are stopping this and saying, nope, I'm not letting this continue. This is not the way it's going to be. I am not going to expect perfection from my child just because it makes me feel bad when they aren't perfect. We have that power. We get to make a difference for them and for the next generation. It's huge. It's huge. It's also a lot of responsibility. And so knowing that we have to have grace with ourselves, because again, the goal is not perfection with our children. So we don't have to get this right every time. We don't have to completely heal ourselves of this to be good enough, right? It's not one more thing we have to do to get perfect children. But just knowing that the work that can be done there doesn't just impact you, it impacts them too, can be enough to really say, hey, I don't want to feel the guilt and shame anymore. I don't want to feel the ickiness of I'm a bad mom just because they're not living up to perfection that doesn't exist. Hopefully, this is a message that as your children are navigating the school year, navigating relationships with friends, sports, all the things, you can keep this in mind. This message can just go along with you as you navigate conversations with other people about your kids, when you get praise about your children's behavior, and just know that we don't have to internalize that. Easier said than done, but we can start to separate that apart. That is it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, if you feel like this is a message that other moms need to hear, I would really appreciate it if you would share the link to this episode with somebody else in your life. I think this is really a conversation that we're not talking about a lot, but it is highly important, especially in this world of so much parenting advice. It's important that we're looking at, hey, what is our role and responsibility as parents? And what does that mean about us as a mom, as a person, when things look differently than we hoped they would? If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, if you could leave a rating and review of the show, that would be amazing. Anywhere else you listen, leaving a rating is huge for the show, and it means a lot to me. Thank you so much for tuning in. You are worthy, Mama.